I want to welcome all of you here to the Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government. Our forum tonight is one that is going to be most relevant and timely. I heard it today at noon, so I have the advantage of knowing that you're about to hear a great lecture. It is my distinct honor to introduce to you tonight the person who is going to introduce our speaker, Laura Radeke. Right. I always like to mention that the Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government is here to preserve the legacy of Minnesota's greatest legislator in its history, Gordon Rosenmeier of Little Falls, who was considered by Minnesota historians to be the most powerful, the most influential, and the most respected legislator in all of Minnesota history. So this program is set up to honor his legacy. And Laura Radeke is the person who always puts together good programs for speakers, including bringing Tom Hanson here from the University of Minnesota as its resident diplomat in international relations. With no further ado, it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you Laura Radeke.
The Rosenmeier Center for State and Local Government has as its mission the education of our area's citizens on key issues that will affect all of us. And tonight, in an effort to help us see more clearly what is happening in the world, we are pleased to invite our presenter, Thomas Hanson, former diplomat with the U.S. Department of State and now diplomat in residence at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. Please read his complete bio in your program and learn more about his distinguished career on the world stage. Just a few months into the invasion of Ukraine by Putin's Russia, we find ourselves in the midst of a whirlwind of questions surrounding the unspeakable death and destruction in Ukraine. What does it mean for people everywhere as we struggle with being stunned that something like this could even be happening in our modern Western world? Our presenter, Thomas Hanson, will help clarify the many tentacles of the war on Ukraine. If you have ever heard him speak before, you know you will leave CLC tonight with an increased understanding, even if you may not feel comforted by it. So please join me in welcoming our presenter and foreign policy expert, Thomas Hanson.
Well, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you, Steve. It's wonderful to be back here again, that we're all in person. It's a wonderful place, and thanks so much to the Rosenmeier Forum for hosting the event tonight. I wish we had a happier subject to discuss, but it's an important one, and I'm going to try to explain what's happening in Ukraine, what the motivations are, the narratives that are at play, and the global impact of this terrible crisis. It's a tragedy. This is a barbaric invasion. You know, with COVID and now this, we're living truly in a time of war and pestilence, marking this era. The economic effects of what Putin has done are harming Ukraine, but also harming Russia and harming the global economy. The World Trade Organization estimates the global GDP will go down by about 1.5% at least in the coming year because of this crisis. The Ukrainian GDP will be cut in half and maybe more depending on how things go. The Russian economy too, by maybe 15% will go down. You know, the refugee toll is growing in Ukraine. 2/3 of all Ukrainian children have been displaced, 2/3. This is a country of 44 million. You know, the French diplomat Talleyrand in the 17th century famously said once, "It was worse than a crime, it was a blunder." And I think that the Russians have made a serious blunder here. In fact, there are analysts now saying that this is arguably the worst decision of Russian statecraft since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Because back then, just like now, the Russian, at that time, Russian Empire underestimated their adversary. They underestimated Japan. The idea that Japan could have risen so quickly to a strength that would allow them to humiliatingly defeat the Russian Tsarist Empire, which they did. And that defeat by the Russians led to the Revolution of 1905, which weakened the Tsarist system. And of course, it was only 10 years or so later that the whole Tsarist system collapsed. I'm not saying that's going to happen in Russia, because for the moment, Putin enjoys 83% support, unfortunately, among a population that is being spoon-fed a very tendentious view of what's going on. But Russia is suffering a lot from this. They were already sort of stunned by COVID. It's estimated that Russia had about 1 million excess deaths from COVID, which is one of the higher numbers. So, their country is depleted, and on top of that, now they've done this invasion, which, as I say, is having all kinds of unintended effects. So the Ukraine crisis is also propelling trends forward that were already in motion because of the COVID epidemic. So we're seeing a kind of a double whammy hitting the global economy and world politics. We are clearly now heading toward a fragmentation of the world economy. The globalization will enter a totally new phase now. We're entering a time of blocks. We're getting back now to geopolitical blocks. And in essence, we're witnessing the violent eruptions of a great tectonic shift of global power that's underway in the world today. China is rising, as we all know. Our goal, stated just yesterday by Anthony Blinken in Kiev, is to weaken Russia. Our goal is not necessarily to help the people of Ukraine, it is to weaken Russia. This is a geopolitical struggle, a larger geopolitical struggle. And it's not necessarily going to have a positive impact on U.S. power in the world. There are some very contradictory results already from this invasion, which I will, in our reaction to it, which I will attempt to delineate this evening. As I say, many ramifications from this crisis. Now, as I said, this is coming on the heels of the pandemic that we're still in. Here you see the Omicron variant with its 37 mutations from the Delta. It's still mutating, as we all know. I mean, Minnesota statistics are not going in the right direction right now. We still don't know what the outcome of this will be, but we do know that the effects of the COVID pandemic have been severe, especially on the global economy. We're all feeling the inflation that is resulting from the supply chain crisis, which is a direct result of COVID. It's also, at present, a result of China's approach to COVID, which is a zero infection approach, where China is, for example, closing down a city like Shanghai based on a fairly small number of cases. And this is having a big disruptive effect on goods coming out of China. We've been living with containerization, world trade going by sea. We've been living with what they call just-in-time production and supply chains. In other words, very complex trade networks come together, goods arrive at the point where they'll be sold. They arrive just in time. Companies keep very low inventories, saving money that way, saving overhead. And that model is what has fallen apart in the aftermath of COVID. And so the word now is we're moving toward just-in-case supply chains. And that means relocating supply chains, making them more resilient. As I say, even before Ukraine, this trend toward fragmentation of the world economy was already underway because of this factor. Now, the other effect of COVID has been, of course, a tremendous increase in the inequality worldwide. I mean, we see it most strikingly in the wealthiest among us, but it's having a deeper effect. Rick Nolan at noon pointed out to me that there was a report just this morning that Jeff Bezos' wealth now is like $224 billion. In other words, he has now not tripled his wealth, but quadrupled his wealth since the pandemic began, which is almost difficult to wrap your mind around. The only non-American there is Bernard Arnault, who is a luxury CEO in France. This is the World Bank most recent map of global inequality. And as you can see, the Americas do not fare all that well on a global basis when it comes to inequality. These trends are obviously disruptive, potentially disruptive to social stability in many countries, and I think are part of what is heating up the local politics, national politics worldwide. It certainly was a big factor in the French election, which just took place. Now, as I mentioned, the economic effects are widespread. This is just from COVID. I'll get to the effects of Ukraine in a minute. I'm starting off just setting the stage here of what already was underway. So this chart from the IMF as of October, these were the projections for growth by region in the world. And the two hardest hit regions, as you might predict, have been Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, Africa is the growing continent now. They will, according to the UN, have 40% of all humanity by the end of this century. 40% of all humans will be living in Africa, according to current trends. And they are predicted to have the lowest growth rate going forward. In addition, the food prices are already rising pre-COVID. The fact that Ukraine and Russia account for 30% of all grain exports in the world mean that this chart now would be even more severe. And so countries all around the world, especially in the developing world, are facing now massive inflation coming from oil and gas price increases, food price increases, and the fact that in the West, developed economies are raising interest rates. We're trying to get inflation under control. Well, this will make it more expensive for the emerging markets to finance their debts. It makes it more expensive and more difficult for them to do that. So in Latin America, we're seeing the results of this in the form of increased populism. Many elections right now across Latin America are electing populist leaders of various stripes, both right and left. There's no clear trend. I mean, an example of this is an election coming up later this year, very interesting one in Brazil, where you'll have a populist of the right, Bolsonaro, running against a populist of the left, Lula, who's out of prison now and running again. He's a former president. So Latin America is having these kind of effects from COVID. Africa, it's really a poignant situation because until 2020, Africa had the fastest growth rates in the world. The country with the fastest growth rate the last few years has been Ethiopia, of all places. Now, of course, they're starting from a slightly lower base, but still, many positive trends in Africa. And a continent-wide free trade agreement had just been signed in Africa. 55 countries, there are that many countries in Africa, signed, at least in theory, to create a free trade zone. Marvelous developments happening in this continent of the future. Well, COVID and now the inflation crisis are hitting Africa hard, and the result there is not populism, but rather coups d'etats. It's political instability that is beginning to, here you can just see the coups and conflicts just as of November 2021 from last year. So as I say, this is the concerns in these parts of the global South have very much to do with the economic effects of Ukraine and of COVID, far less the politics of it all, as I will describe later. So once again, this is pre-Ukraine invasion. As some of you may know, every year in January, the World Economic Forum holds a big conference in Davos, Switzerland. It's kind of the global elite, both economic and political, major political leaders attend, the Xi Jinpings. I think Trump went once to this, and above all, the economic elite. And so the last 2 years, it's been virtual. They have not actually gone to the snowy Swiss mountains. It's been virtual. And every year, the World Economic Forum sends out a poll, a survey to all attendees. What are the greatest global risks in your mind, in your country, in your part of the world? Name 10 and rank order them. Well, this year, there was a greater prevalence of climate-related risks. You can see extreme weather, climate action. The global elite, if this is what you can call it, is starting to recognize this. But the huge surprise this year, coming out of nowhere to third place, was mental health deterioration. Apparently, global elites, and this is not just in the US, but worldwide, are worried about this, whether it's their own mental health that they're thinking about or of the societies they see around them. But I think it's worth noting that just a matter of weeks before the Ukraine crisis, there was no cognizance that there might be something as severe as a war in Europe that would emerge. And of course, most pundits all along doubted that the Russians would invade. Yes, they'd build up troops, they'd put on pressure, trying to force a compromise from the Ukrainians, but they wouldn't invade. And of course, that turned out to be wrong. Now, the scenes we're all seeing, especially on CNN, it's constant, it's wall to wall, of the suffering, the tragedies, the individual tragedies going on in Ukraine from this war. Of course, Mariupol is just being utterly destroyed. It is important geographically as a kind of a linchpin as Russia tries to control the entire coast of Ukraine. Everyone has been taken by and impressed by Volodymyr Zelensky, who is really rising to his role. He's an excellent communicator. He's inspiring his nation. He's just doing a marvelous job. I think it's striking and worth mentioning that this was a huge turnaround. Before the war, he was down to about 25% approval in Ukraine, and it looked as if he would be pretty quickly voted out of office, if not thrown out of office. One reason being that in the Pandora Papers, where 70 news organizations, consortium around the world, they've come up with a number of studies showing tax avoidance, how the world elite shields its money. The first was the Panama Papers, and now this year, the Pandora Papers. And Zelensky was the worst offender among global leaders in the Pandora Papers. And this is part of why he was cratering in Ukraine before this. And of course, now he has redeemed himself, has shown a side of himself that is inspirational, and is carrying his nation through. It's amazing how politics can turn around sometimes. So just yesterday, Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, and Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, were in Kyiv, promising more aid and more support. As I say, the word is we want to weaken Russia in the process, so we're preparing Ukraine for months and months and months of heavy fighting against the Russians. We've just named an ambassador, Bridget Brink, who has been our ambassador to Slovakia until now. She will, over the next weeks, reopen the embassy in Kyiv with the staff, and it's a sign of our support of Ukraine. And we're giving very significant weaponry. Now, we're giving 155 howitzers, which is the best we have. These are very powerful weapons. We're providing 90 of them to Ukraine. That's a good number. It'll be a question of how to get them in unnoticed to the front. That's the only problem, because the Russians are threatening to take these things out as they come in. So whether we have a way of hiding them as we bring them in, we'll see. And also a new kind of a drone that we've developed especially for Ukraine. It's called a Phoenix Ghost drone. You know, the Bayraktar drones from Turkey have already done tremendous damage to the Russian forces. When they came in toward Kiev, and it was like they were in a funnel of roads, and they paused, they were just decimated by Bayraktar drones, which have been provided by Turkey. So this is, we're giving them 121 of these aerial systems, which will be used. So we really are helping Ukraine, partly because we cannot intervene directly, because Ukraine is not a part of NATO, and they do not have what we call Article 5 commitments. So we're not doing a no-fly zone, as you know. We don't want to get into direct confrontation with Russian forces. And so this is the next best. So, so what in the world is on Vladimir Putin's mind? Why has this happened? You know, he's been talking about this for some months. He wrote a long, rambling article in July about Ukraine and how Ukraine and Russia are actually one historically, in his view. And in that he wrote, step by step, Ukraine was dragged into a dangerous geopolitical game aimed at turning Ukraine into a barrier between Europe and Russia, a springboard against Russia. And that's what the Russian people are being told, that this is not just about Ukraine, it is the United States and NATO using Ukraine as a springboard to eventually attack Russia, which is what the Russian people are being. So actually, he's gone so far as to say, better to fight them now in Ukraine than to have to fight them on Russian soil later. I mean, this is clearly a propaganda line, but this is what the Russian people are being told. Now, his main concern, of course, has been NATO expansion, the expansion of the Atlantic Alliance in a series of waves and phases ever closer to the borders of Russia. You know, after the Cold War ended, the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, and James Baker, his Secretary of State, were very skillful in getting German unification and getting Germany into NATO. They were not thinking in terms of expanding further. They were thinking of something called Partnership for Peace, which was a program to allow the newly free countries, including Russia, to adhere to NATO short of membership. The decision to go a different direction and to expand NATO was taken by Bill Clinton in 1994. That was the crucial year. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons why it happened. We can maybe in the questions talk about that. Some domestic reasons. I mean, the Polish government was weighing in very strongly with the Clinton administration saying, look, we have a tiny window here. Russia will never change. We got to start acting now because they'll be back in a negative way. Whereas those who opposed expansion, and that included Clinton's Secretary of State, William Perry, who threatened to resign over the decision, their argument was, you know, let's give reform in Russia a chance. Let's see, you know, let's not make it harder for the reformers by taking a step like expanding NATO, because it did make it harder for the reformers in Russia. Anyway, that's all water under the bridge. The decision was made, and by 1999, there was an expansion that included Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. They call the Visegrad countries. The second big wave, the biggest wave, came in 2004. And that is when Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the 3 Baltic states came in. Right on the border of Russia. I mean, if Russia has a problem with Ukraine, why didn't they have a problem with the Baltic states, which are like a stone's throw from St. Petersburg? Putin had been president of Russia already since 2004 when that expansion took place, and he accepted it. He said, okay, the Baltic states have a Western tradition, they always have. You know, they were the captive nations during the Cold War. They had their own category in US foreign policy. And so Putin said, okay, all right, but no further. And this is where the red line was drawn. The red line that Putin talks about now was drawn in 2004. So this has been a slowly building crisis, to say the very least. And of course, we had in 2008, we had the crisis over Georgia when President George W. Bush tried to speed up NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, and the Russians reacted by seizing 2 parts of Georgia, as we all recall. That was during George W. Bush, and the U.S. did not react in that case. We did nothing in reaction to that. We were angry, but there was nothing like what's happening with Ukraine right now, not even close. So it's been building, as I say, and now we have the current situation. What are Russia's goals? Well, the number one, as we just discussed here, is to end NATO expansion, and especially into Ukraine and Belarus, if they got that far. Second, the demilitarization of Ukraine. Well, that explains the bombing that's going on all over Ukraine. They're knocking out logistics depots, airports. I mean, they're trying to, as they say, demilitarize. So there's a lot of random bombing going on of strategic structures. And so Ukraine is just being decimated day by day by this. And then finally, denazification. Now, that's a poser. What is he talking about? Because Zelensky's Jewish, and most of his cabinet is Jewish. In fact, I know the young woman who has been his spokesman, Yulia Mendel. She visited Minnesota as part of a journalist group a few years ago. She's Jewish. So what in the world is he talking about? And, well, I mean, there are in Ukraine a number of brigades. I'll show you one of them in a minute, which the Russians consider to be right-wing and therefore Nazi and therefore to be denazified. I'll talk more about this in a minute. But the idea that the government is a Nazi government is absolutely absurd. And that's what the Russian people are being told. They're being told that this is a neo-Nazi regime that is working with the West. Now, the other aspect for the Russians, and I think this applies to Putin as well, is there's an identity issue here. You know, in Russian culture, this part of Ukraine here is essential. It's considered the foundation of the Russian state historically, the Kievan Rus of the 11th century. The Russians date their statehood to Kiev and to the foundation of this polity. In addition, the Russian Orthodox Church started in Kiev. And this is Archbishop Kirill, who is a very nationalistic head of the Russian Orthodox Church, strongly supportive of Putin. He wants to get the Ukrainian Orthodox Church back into the fold. There's now a separate Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So the church is embroiled in this, and this brings along a lot of the Russian population, the older Russian population, the fact that the church is so strongly supportive. It's, I think, accepted now that Putin is, to some extent, a believer, and this adds to it all. And then Crimea, which is one of the most beautiful places in Europe, actually. We think of it as this war-torn area, but it's actually a splendorous place. Once again, important in Russian history. Chekhov lived there. The Yalta Conference took place there. All kinds of cultural and other sorts of associations. The Crimea was to Russia what Greece was to Europe in the 19th century. It's the place where all Russians went to sample a sense of antiquity. No justification whatsoever, but it's part of this identity issue, for better or worse, the Russians have. And once again, this Azov battalion, I mean, they're real. Their base is in Mariupol, which is why the Russians are obliterating Mariupol. They're trying to be rid of the Azov battalion. There's another one called Pravy Sektor, which in Russian means right sector. These are the groups that actually in 2014, drove Yanukovych out. It wasn't the street protesters. There was these groups that did. I remember visiting the Yanukovych villa, with his antique car collection, all this terrible. It's a place where Paul Manafort used to hang out a lot. And there above the building was the black flag of Pravi Sector, right? This is ours, we did this. So, I mean, they exist, but they're not, I mean, the political party that represents them gets only 2% of the vote. And although after 2014 until about 2017, these brigades were stronger than the Ukrainian National Army. They were stronger. And so one reason that the Obama administration did not send lethal aid to Ukraine, because the Obama team never sent lethal weapons to Ukraine. The Trump administration did. And of course, now Biden is. But the argument was, we don't know the weapons will go. And in the congressional testimony, Obama representatives said, we don't want weapons falling into the hands of neo-Nazis. That was part of the rationale. And a number of Americans going over to fight in Ukraine right now are far-right Americans who have long been associated with the Azov group because they've had very close contacts with certain elements in the US as well. So once again, they exist. We can't just pretend they're not there, but they do not have the influence that Russia claims. Quite the contrary. And in fact, they have declining influence, and it's no rationale at all for what has happened, not for 1 second. So the other problem here is this is the nature of Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's a very divided country culturally. You can see the Russian-speaking parts, which is exactly where the fighting is going on. And then Western Ukraine is a very different country in many ways. Western Ukraine, for most of its history, was either part of Poland or was under the Habsburg Empire, to the point where the religion there is, it's called Uniate. They look to the Pope. Western Ukrainians are, for all purposes, Catholic. I mean, as you'd expect, with the long association with Poland. So this is a big cultural divide. And you can see, for example, here, this was an election back in 2010. The Russian-backed candidate, Yanukovych. You can see in blue the voting heaviest right in the Donbass there for the Russian candidate. And the others for Tymoshenko. Look at that very, very anti-Russian, if you will, part of Western Ukraine around Lviv. So I think the Russians would be very happy to let Western Ukraine go its own merry way. They are not trying to conquer all of Ukraine, necessarily. They'd be willing to make all of Ukraine neutral if the Ukrainians will go along, but minus Crimea. But they're not, as far as they're concerned, it's a different area. And here you can see, this was a couple of years ago when Putin started talking about something called Novorossiya, which means New Russia. And you can see it's the Donbass, it's Crimea, and then this whole other area, which Putin thinks is actually Russian and Russian-oriented. And if you look in the upper right, the quote from Putin there, he said, these territories were given to Ukraine in the 1920s by the Soviet government. Why? God knows. Putin is not a fan of the Soviet Union. He does not want to restore the Soviet Union. He looks to a pre-Soviet Russia as his model. He wants a great Russia. He wants a great power Russia. But, for example, he basically detests Putin, or rather Lenin, because Lenin, in setting up the Soviet Union, made it into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, broken down into 15 republics, each with their own identity within the Soviet Union. As far as Putin is concerned, this began the Ukrainian sense of consciousness and the Ukrainian eventual attempt to have its own state. So he blames the communists for this. They were too internationalist. They weren't Russian enough. So this is a, and then he blames another Ukrainian, Nikita Khrushchev, who was from Ukraine, for giving Crimea to this Ukrainian republic within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. as a kind of a symbolic gesture. So the Russians are trying to go to a pre-Soviet narrative about Russia and Ukraine. And so you can see the military action follows very much this Novorossiya concept. And just the other day, for the first time, a Russian general said that actually what we're going to do now, we think, is to move all the way across the south, past Odessa, and hook up with Moldova, with something called Transnistria, which is a breakaway province of Moldova. And that brings you, really right back to Novorossiya. You can see in the brown there, that's Transnistria. And you can see that Novorossiya goes right up to that point. So is that what the Russians are going to try to do now? That's what experts in Washington now are asking themselves. And for the moment, the battle is shaping up in the Donbass. Having been decimated around Kiev, the Russians have regrouped, and they're going now after eastern Ukraine. So you're going to have troops coming up from the south and then down from Russia past Izum. They're going to try to box in 40,000 crack Ukrainian forces that are there still in Donbass. They're going to try to squeeze them and decimate them. And they think that by doing that, they will have broken the back of the Ukrainian army. And at that point, the question is, will they then turn on Kiev? Is this a step-by-step, slowly grinding policy? And that's a possibility. And our provision of arms now, of heavy, heavy arms, are to help Ukraine to resist this potential strategy that the Russians seem to be enacting. This is the new general, Dvornikov, who will be Alexander Dvornikov. He was the head of their forces in Syria, and now he's the one trying to reorganize the invasion. Why is Russia acting now? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, they believe that China has Russia's back, and I will talk more about that later, the China-Russia relationship. They believe that they have a lot of support from China going forward. And also, they believe that they have military superiority over the U.S. for the coming decade, perhaps, because they have developed a new generation of hypersonic weapons that they believe we cannot counter. I'll talk more about the nuclear arms race that's underway. So those are two basic reasons why they think now is the time to do it. Meanwhile, Lukashenko of Belarus seemed to be heading toward the west just, 8 months ago when they were having massive protests by young Belarusians. Putin stepped in to help Lukashenko, and now Lukashenko is tipping totally toward Russia. They've announced that they will allow Russian nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil. This is a huge turnaround. And this poses NATO with its biggest challenge. And this is where the American troops going over now to Europe, this is where they're going. You see that little stretch in red there? That's what they call the Suwalki Gap. It's between Belarus, which now has become a Russian ally, potentially with nuclear weapons, and Kaliningrad there, which is a Russian enclave full of nuclear weapons, full of Iskander nuclear missiles. It's like a porcupine. And how easy would it be to close off that gap, right, with a quick assault? If so, the Baltic states would be cut off, as you can see. There would be no land approach from NATO to the Baltic states. So this is, I think, even more than Ukraine. Long term, this is NATO's biggest concern right now. So Putin, he does show a few signs of paranoia. He meets even with his own advisors at a great, great distance. And he unfortunately has a lot of support among the elite there. The oligarchs have no influence at all. They have their money because the real elite allows them to. Putin and his ilk are what they call siloviki. these are the former KGB and military intelligence people from the old regime who have regrouped and control the government now. So it's not just Putin, unfortunately. There are people in this group that could be worse than Putin, actually. That's Washington's assessment. So, you know, it's an issue. Now, I mean, one of them being a fellow named Nikolai Patrushev. If you ever see his name emerging, watch out. Anyway, there's a fellow named Sergei Karaganov. I actually met with him some in the 90s. He's been around a long time as a major advisor. He has a lot of cred with Putin. And he's been writing articles, giving speeches in Russia, in Russian actually, in recent months, actually up to a year ago, explaining Russia's worldview. And this predates their invasion. And this is what he says. He says, Europe and the West blew their chance in the 1990s. They could have integrated Russia into a Western framework, but they didn't. They expanded NATO instead. And as a result, now that China is rising and becoming a threat, they cannot bring Russia on board against China. It's too late. Russia is going with China. And that this was a total strategic blunder by the West. He then says, Europe is of no interest to us now. He says, 300 to 400 years of history are coming to an end. Russia no longer aspires to be European. That's over. And Russia is very prepared to have a total rupture with Europe. It could last a decade. Once again, this is months before the invasion. And Russia will become an invulnerable citadel with these new weapons that they have, and their future then is not in Europe. Their future is as a northern Eurasia. Russia, and this is what Putin talks about now. Russia is northern Eurasia, 11 time zones. And Russia's goal will be to develop a greater Eurasian partnership with China. As he says, China is where Russia will get its capital, its technology. And he predicts that after about 10 years, the Europeans, especially Germany, will realize they cannot do without markets in Russia and Eurasia. They will start to gravitate into this new center of world power, and they will move away from the US at that point, which, as Putin tells it, will be in such a stage of polarization and decadence by then. This is the Russian line, that the Europeans will willingly change their orientation. Once again, this is a propaganda thing, but I fear that Putin and his team actually believe this. When it comes to Ukraine, what Karaganov says is, you know, we thought it would work out better than it did, the invasion. We hoped that some elements would stage a coup against Zelensky, and that we'd find a way to, you know, start talking about neutrality. But that's not happening. So what he predicts is there'll be a partition of Ukraine. This is his prediction. And there'll be a part of Ukraine, probably this Novorossiya area, that will be close to Russia, maybe a separate state, but close to Russia. How about the Western Ukraine? Okay, this is the Russian line. This is what they're telling their people. Yes, well, Western Ukraine will be divided up among Poland, Romania, and Hungary. It will basically cease to exist. Now, it is true that there are large, in Ukraine, Romanian, Polish, and Hungarian minorities that feel oppressed. And in Ukraine, Viktor Orban, from his first days in politics, promised that he would get the Hungarian part of Ukraine back for Hungary. That's been a constant on his agenda. They lost it at the Versailles Treaty in 1919. So I would not rule out that the Russians are discreetly in touch with Orban about this possible endgame. For whatever reason, Orban, of course, is not helping much with the sanctions and such against Russia. So, I mean, this, as I say, I think this is a worldview that may be totally off base. It may be borderline crazy, but it does seem to be the way that this group is thinking. And I doubt that the younger generation in Russia thinks this way. I mean, here's a photo of a protest in Moscow a couple days after the invasion, before they cracked down. And you can see it's all young faces. It's all young people. You know, Putin and his team are the last generation that was formed in the Soviet Union. The new generations have had a much more open history, and a lot of them are leaving. I met a couple in Minneapolis a couple weeks ago, young Russians from Moscow that had gotten out via Armenia. They were in town setting up an installation at the Russian Museum of Art. And they said, we're not going back. You know, they said, this could last decades. This is our whole lives. We can't go back. And so they're losing a lot of their best minds, young techies who don't want a future like the one I just described. So over time, will this have an effect? For the moment, the Russians are effectively cracking down on any dissent. But in the longer term, what will happen? And you're seeing all this in the morale of young Russian soldiers. It's been widely reported they're not really on board. There's a famous scene in War and Peace. It takes place, as always, at a ball, at a fancy ball in St. Petersburg, and it's the eve of the Battle of Borodino, where, you know, Napoleon is at the gates of Moscow, basically. And so Prince Andrei is there, and he's asked, Prince Andrei, who's going to win tomorrow? Who will win this battle against Napoleon? And he says, it all depends on what is in the hearts of each individual soldier. And I think that these young soldiers don't have their hearts in it for Russia, and I think the Ukrainians do. And, you know, historically, Russians have always fought best defending their homeland. They have not fought that well outside of their homeland. This may be why Putin is bringing in Chechen fighters. This is Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen forces. They're very fierce fighters. About 20,000 of them now fighting in Donbass. And bringing in Syrian soldiers. The Russians, you know, saved Assad's leadership, and now the Syrians are repaying this by sending in their forces. So it's becoming, to some degree, internationalized. The Russians also have nuclear weapons that they're deploying right up next to Ukraine. This is the Iskander missile. It's a tactical nuclear weapon. Russia has 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. We have about 200. And Putin is saying that they will use them if need be. In fact, he's said that with these big howitzers coming in, big heavy arms, they might hit these with tactical nukes. Now, I think this is a threat that's an idle threat, but we don't know, and the dangers of escalation do exist in this crisis. There's no question about it. Now, changing gears and getting into the effects of this crisis on the global economy and inflation and such. Yes, we are imposing sanctions on Russia. There's an excellent book that recently came out by Nicholas Mulder called The Economic Weapon, which documents the history of America's use of sanctions, because it's been a key arrow in our quiver all through our history. For example, we imposed a very strict oil embargo on Japan in the late 30s, basically starving their army and navy. Japan had no access to oil. And so it was one reason that the Japanese took a suicidal decision and attacked Pearl Harbor. So there's a long history of this. So Russia produces a lot of oil. You can see their largest consumers, China being number one. This is oil, not gas now. It's estimated that China could easily buy up and use all of Russia's oil and gas production and all of its agricultural production. And that seems to be what China and Russia are looking at now, is it's a total submersion of Russian resources into this partnership they talk about. And you can see, we all know the effects of the crisis on the ruble, of course, prices of natural gas. And here you can see on the right just how dependent Europe is on Russian oil and gas. These charts show that the percentage of overall energy that they get from gas, and then within that, in yellow, how much of it's from Russia. And you can see Germany, it's about 60%. Czech Republic, it's 100%. The Russians are behemoths when it comes to natural gas. Gazprom is the largest gas producer in the world. It is larger than BP, Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Saudi Aramco put together. It produces 540 billion cubic meters a year. About a third of that has been going to Europe. Europe in general is 40% dependent on this gas. And so, you know, we don't use Russian resources. We're asking a lot of our allies right now to cut off Russian oil and gas. And quite frankly, we are going to profit greatly. This is Ted Cruz's dream become true. He is in hog heaven right now down there in Texas because for years now, he's been saying Europe has got to stop buying liquefied natural gas from Russia. They must buy it from the US, i.e. from Texas. And that's kind of 30% oil. This is agricultural. I forgot to include that. So we now, as you've seen, President Biden is shifting gears, doing a 180-degree shift on his energy policies, climate policies. When he first came in, he was telling the oil and gas companies to stop exploring on certain lands, stop. Now he's saying to them, this is war. It's your patriotic duty to ramp up production to the max as soon as possible. So it's war. And so, you know, oil is fungible. A lot of countries have strategic reserves of oil. The Saudis always keep a lot. If there's a crisis, more oil can be pumped into the world market pretty easily. Not the case with gas. Gas is pretty much what's produced is used. There's no flexibility at all. So for us to ramp up enough to really supply the Europeans would take until about 2030 because it means building ports. They'll have to build all kinds of liquefaction ports because as this LNG arrives, it has to be processed. It's very complicated before it can be used. And so there are plans for a lot of ports to take this gas and oil coming from Texas, primarily. So as I say, for the U.S. economy, this shift is very positive, very propitious. Ted Cruz was so angered by the fact that the Germans especially were buying Russian gas that he put a block on all ambassadorial appointments in the first 9 months of the Biden administration. A total block on all ambassadors until the U.S. forced Germany to stop buying the gas. Well, now the war has produced the same result. As the prices go up now for gas and for agricultural products, this is an issue for the emerging markets. You know, I talked about Latin America and Africa. The World Bank estimates that about 100 million people have fallen into poverty due to COVID, and another 40 million due to Ukraine. The total debt for emerging and developing economies right now relative to GDP is at a 50-year high. And they're going to have to start servicing these debts. It's going to be very destabilizing. There's a need for sovereign debt relief, for restructuring these debts in the developing world. Problem, though, is that the aid landscape has changed. Governments no longer give much aid of this kind. The U.S. government doesn't give much at all. 2/3 of all low-income country loans, 2/3 are from China. Of all loans to the developing world, 2/3 from China. The bulk of the rest are from the commercial sector, from commercial creditors of all kinds. How would you coordinate this to, for instance, in the G20, which usually would do the debt relief, if it's mainly China and it's private sector, how do you restructure? So, and by the way, the G20 is, you know, it's a fairly recent institution. It doesn't even have a secretariat. It all depends on who the current chair is, and so there's a lot of question marks right now about the G20 anyway. Now, we talk about the world uniting against Russia on Ukraine. If we look a little deeper, these are the countries that are really imposing sanctions on Russia right now. And they're the ones you would expect. Sort of our closest allies in the transatlantic realm, the Anglosphere, going out toward Australia and New Zealand, South Korea, Japan. This, by the way, is Russia's enemies list that they came up, these are now declared their enemies for what they're doing on sanctions. But the rest of the world is not coming along on this. Here you can see the countries that have and have not imposed. It's kind of a funky chart, but anyway, look at the countries that have not imposed sanctions, have refused. It's basically the entire global south. I mean, we're talking about China, India, Brazil, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, all of Latin America, including Mexico, Africa, all of Africa, Middle East. The Saudis won't even return Biden's phone calls. And Israel, which has very close relations with Russia. And a lot of these countries are setting up currency swap arrangements with Russia to avoid the dollar, to be able to keep buying things from, with no sanctions. And that's South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, India, China, and others. They're actively going around the dollar sanctions. I think this was summed up because what we see, as I say, is the global south not going along. And I wonder whether this new world order that's emerging will be a little bit like the old Cold War to this extent, that you'll have a US-led transatlantic Japan grouping. You'll have a Eurasian grouping, which will be China, Russia, perhaps Iran, Central Asia. And then you'll have a non-aligned movement, just like during the Cold War, of countries in the global south that are non-aligned. It seems to be going that way already, just a few months into the crisis. So Cyril Ramaphosa gave a speech in early April of South Africa, in which he refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He abstained on the 2 UN resolutions. And he said that the UN Security Council now is obsolete because it disadvantages developing countries. He said Ukraine has exposed the glaring double standards of the international community. All that's happening with Ukraine, all the attention, CNN, wall to wall, nothing like that on Yemen, nothing like that on Gaza, nothing like that on various things happening in Africa. He said this is racism. This is white racism being perpetrated by the old imperial powers, United States, Europe, and he would add Japan. He said, and the diplomats coming now to Pretoria on this issue astound him. He said, we're being attacked for our policies by Western diplomats who seem to think that they are here to instruct us. For the global south, this is a European crisis, quite bluntly. And you know, what really has got Washington upset is that India, which we have been wooing for over a decade to join us in an anti-China coalition. We want India to stop being neutral. We brought them into something called the Quad with Japan and Australia. And here suddenly is Modi cooperating with Putin to avoid the sanctions and refusing to condemn the Russians. Washington is very upset by this, and it doesn't fit into the playbook that we had planned on. At the G20 last week of finance ministers, the United States called for a boycott, a walkout. It was the moment that the Russian representative comes in, everyone should walk out. Well, 3 countries walked out, US, UK, and Canada. And that was it. So this is not a global coalition, to say the least. And where I get concerned, and this gets into US power going forward, is that our sanctions have been so extreme against Russia that there's blowback starting to happen, as I'll describe. We took the step of seizing Russia's central bank assets. Russia has a surplus, national surplus of about $620 billion. $300 billion of it is in Western institutions. U.S. bonds, banks, just like China, owns half of our bonds, right? And this has always been considered sacrosanct. Well, we seized $300 billion of Russian assets. As Lavrov said, this was theft. Well, I guess. We've done that to Iran, but to do this to a major country like Russia it sets a precedent. As the Financial Times put it, these sanctions are earth-shaking. They have broken the mold. By weaponizing the dollar this way, the U.S. is smashing the global financial system into rival blocks. Along these lines, Credit Suisse, which is a major financial house, of course, has said that with these sanctions now, the Bretton Woods system, the post-Bretton Woods system of 1971 is coming to an end. It says the central bank freeze marks the death of this and the start of a new monetary order centered around commodity-based currencies in the East. And as Credit Suisse says, if your dollars can vanish at the whim of the issuer, the logic dictates a reserve outside of the dollar-based financial system. As I say, Beijing has $3.2 trillion in foreign currency reserves, and they're watching this. The head of the Chinese central bank said a few weeks ago, China should now help the world to get rid of the dollar hegemony sooner rather than later. Janet Yellen had just last week issued a new warning saying the U.S. is prepared to impose these kind of sanctions against China if Beijing moves against Taiwan. She said, I believe we've shown that we can, in the case of Russia, use such sanctions effectively. I think you should not doubt our ability or resolve to do the same in other circumstances. So where does this go? The dollar right now, in 1999, the dollar was held by 71%. 71% of all global assets were in dollars. This year, it's gone down to 59%, and it's going down further. China is setting up a digital currency. They're setting up their own version of what we call SWIFT, which is the messaging service for international transactions. It's called CIPS. 100 countries are participating, 1,200 member institutions. Now, the yuan presently accounts for only 2.8% of global reserves. So, I mean, this is something that's stirring, but certainly is not there yet. But China is, as I say, moving ahead toward a digital currency. So, last part of my remarks now, there are things that have been happening now under the Biden administration that I think are worth describing because I'm going to try to discuss the geopolitical politics right now between the great powers in the midst of this crisis. As I say, China is looking away from Europe, looking east across the Urals now for its future. The Russians and Chinese held a major summit on February 4th at the Olympics in the run-up to the crisis in Ukraine. And they issued a 5,000-word joint statement, a kind of a credo of what this new China-Russia partnership is about. And this is what they said. They said, this is a new era. This is the era of the greater Eurasian partnership. There's a redistribution of power going on in the world. It's becoming polycentric. The problem is that some actors representing the minority of mankind, and of course by that he means the West, which is under 10% of humanity right now, although obviously economically far stronger, that this minority is advocating unilateral approaches, resorting to force, interfering in the affairs of other states. They say, look, democracy, every country will go to democracy at its own pace and in the perspective of its own civilization. So they're arguing for an out. Now, this is obviously an excuse for continuing autocracy, but what they're saying is, look, we've got to respect cultural civilizational differences. There must be democracy at the global level, not just one country saying what it should be. And then, of course, they say there are no limits, no forbidden areas of cooperation. Now, the The Chinese are a little bit shocked by what Russia has done. I don't think they expected quite this kind of an invasion. They're straddling. They've had very close relations with Ukraine. They buy a lot of grain from Ukraine. So they're for Ukrainian state sovereignty, but the Chinese say the cause of the crisis is NATO expansion. So they're trying to, I think that this crisis is making it less likely that China will act against Taiwan, because the poor performance of the Russian army is giving them pause. The last real war that China fought was back in 1971, and they lost to Vietnam. How sure can they be about their own forces, right? Just the way the Russians probably overestimated their forces would China. So I think that this is going to make them a little bit more cautious. Now, just 3 days ago, at something called the Boao Forum, Xi Jinping proposed a global security initiative. There should be a new security architecture. Global powers should meet and come up with a new system of indivisible security. And he mentions the security dilemma, which is defensive actions by one party can be interpreted as offensive by the other. That's the engine of a lot of war in human history, is what they call the security dilemma. So he says we have to get around that somehow. So he's kind of calling for a large, a new world order among the large powers. I mean, this is obviously, we're far from that. Now, U.S. policy, on the other hand, has evolved in the last couple of years in a way that is totally bipartisan. The new strategy was announced by Jim Mattis back in 2017, 2016. Basically, it was a mistake to go into Iraq and Afghanistan, horrendous mistake. We've been on a 20-year fool's mission, and now we have to get to the real threat, which is the rise of great powers like Russia and China. We have to counter. The basic American strategy is to prevent any regional hegemon, what we call a peer competitor, from emerging in Asia or Europe. That was World War II, and it was the Cold War, and it's now. So to prevent Russia from becoming stronger in Europe, we have Ukraine. To prevent China from becoming stronger in Europe, we have Taiwan. And these are, in Washington, seen as key issues to pursue this overall strategy. Of course, Biden has his summit of democracy, so he's defining the new era as one of autocracy versus democracy. That is the new era, and we want to support the world's democracies. So the first island chain is very important for us, and especially Taiwan. And this brings me to two very important, actually, policy shifts under the Biden administration, which are part of the mix right now. Up until now, we have been pursuing something called strategic ambiguity, right? On Ukraine, we've said, theoretically, they can join NATO, but they're not going to join anytime soon, and don't worry about it because it'll be like decades, and so it's ambiguous, right? We're trying to satisfy the Ukrainians and the Russians. On Taiwan, there's one China. We agree that it's one China that has to come together, but in the meantime, we're going to support Taiwan, but not necessarily defend them. That's changing now. We're moving away from strategic ambiguity. So a couple of months ago, speaking to the Senate, Eli Ratner from the Defense Department said that Taiwan is strategically critical to vital U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific. It's critical to regional security. Basically saying we are for an independent Taiwan as our ally for our own vital interest. This is a departure from the one China policy and is being seen as such in Beijing. It's subtle, but it is a change. Similarly on Ukraine, we signed in December, a new U.S.-Ukraine charter on strategic partnership, in which we declare Ukraine to be a strategic partner. We declare our unwavering commitment. We say that Ukraine is vital to our national interests, that same phrase. When you start talking about national interests and vital national interests, this is important. We are for integrating Ukraine fully into the European and Euro-Atlantic structures. And the Russians are seeing this as, even though Ukraine is not in NATO, The US bilaterally is bringing Ukraine de facto into the alliance. In fact, Putin said in October, formal membership in NATO may not take place, but military development of the territory is already underway. And I think it's significant. This initiative was announced by Zelensky and Biden in early September. The Russians started mobilizing 5 days later. 5 days after that declaration, the mobilization began. I'm not saying that necessarily it's directly linked, but it's curious. Here are the basic things. I'm coming close to the end here now. So this has brought these two countries closer together. They're developing Eurasia together in the Belt and Road Initiative. Northern Russia, Northern Eurasia will be key in terms of resources, but also in terms of shipping. Global warming is opening up shipping routes here across Northern Eurasia. And the odd factor in this is Iran. To what extent would Iran join into this Eurasian partnership? Right now, we're trying to get back on good terms with Iran, this immense, important country. The talks are on again. There's a more conservative government under Raisi in Iran. There's a new government in Israel, Naftali Bennett there on the right, but just as dedicated to preventing Iran from getting any kind of nuclear weapon, and with the same threat that they will attack Israel will attack if things go too far. So will there be an agreement? Will we be able to kind of wean Iran a bit away? We'll see, because right now it's going the other way. These three countries are starting to have joint naval exercises. And so all of this is in play. Final points, Russia and China are cooperating in Eurasia. Everyone thought that they would compete in Central Asia. In fact, they're cooperating under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. By the way, the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations will be the venue for the new currency, for the new financial system that they talk about. So when there were uprisings in Kazakhstan a few months ago, Russia and China cooperated on that. And that's another collective security treaty organization as well. Now, final couple of points. As the strategic system begins to change, as I say, these tectonics are changing, there's some important decisions being made on the military side. Up until now, China has pursued what they call the limited deterrence strategy, where they have not tried to compete with nuclear weapons. They only have about 250 of them. You can see Russia and the US have 5,000 to 6,000. Well, China now is shifting gears. Their plans are to go from about 270 weapons to 1,000 by 2030. They want to establish mutual assured destruction with the US, just like we had with Russia during the Cold War. We haven't had that up until now with China. They amazingly have allowed this to kind of go along. You're going to hear a lot about this because this seems to be a new threat emerging from China. It is, but it's still 1,000 compared to 5,000. I mean, we still have a tremendous advantage. And more important, though, are these systems that I alluded to earlier. Everyone's developing hypersonic. These are weapons that go so fast and so low, they fly like this. All of our defenses are based on the kind of the loop ballistic missile trajectory of the old days. These things do not do that. They zip along at low altitude. It's almost like in Dr. Strangelove when that plane got through because it was flying so low. And so the Russians have something called this Zircon missile here, which is Mach 9, and which they could deploy off of our coasts, possibly. These are nuclear. The Chinese have developed a fractional orbital bombardment system. It can go 21,000 miles per hour. They launched this a few months ago. It flew around the world backwards and struck. And the Pentagon said this was a near Sputnik moment. That was the declaration for the Pentagon, because we are not that far along on hypersonic. This is why Putin thinks he has a window, especially because just this week they tested their big threat, as far as they would put it, a successful test of the Sarmat ICBM. This thing goes at Mach 27, if you can imagine that. I have a hard time seeing how that happens. As it strikes, it deploys 10 individual hypersonic warheads. As Putin says, there is no defense against this weapon and will not be for a long time. So when they talk about becoming an armed fortress, an impenetrable fortress, this is what they refer to. Washington is scrambling now to figure out how to offset. So I'm going to stop now. You know, it's, to my mind, very sad and unnecessary that the world is gravitating toward blocks the way it is. The threats that we face are global. You know, they're not between nations as much as they are the species and the planet. And it's very sad to see that cooperation stopping, if you will, our own climate policy changing because of this. Just to quote a few final voices here, because sometimes looking to the past helps. Arnold Toynbee, at the end of World War II in the late 40s, wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine, saying, technology has inflamed the institutions of war and of class, which are the two congenital diseases of civilization, utterly fatal maladies. These technologies portend that civilization cannot go on shambling along, right? Before World War I, they called it sleepwalking. Europe slept, and are we sleepwalking today? I mean, how are we ordering our priorities in the current situation, really? I mean, Henry Kissinger said recently, our leaders and their leaders, he's talking about Russia and China, must discuss the limits beyond which they will not push threats. Well, right now there's no dialogue going on between the US and Russia and the US and China. The Cold War generation of American statesmen would never, ever have let this happen. We had for all the tensions with the Soviet Union, we always had close relations, close discussions. Anatoly Dobrinin, their ambassador, was there for 25 years in Washington. He knew everyone in Washington. Because we took the nuclear threat seriously. And I think today we are not taking the nuclear threat seriously. I think that since the 90s, I see this in my students. It's like, nuclear? What nuclear threat, huh? I mean, the press doesn't report it. A lot of what I've just described, I'm sure, is new to you. To my mind, this is a dangerous situation. You know, last time I spoke here, I did refer to JFK, who, you know, looked nuclear Armageddon in the eye during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it changed him significantly. Had he lived, he probably would have pursued very different policies. And so there's a moral dilemma here that I wrestle with. I'm not sure what I think about it. He said in his final major speech at American University in June, before his assassination, and I'm repeating what I said here because this is getting a lot of attention in Washington right now, this speech again. He said, so let us not be blind to our differences, in this case with the Soviet Union, but let us also direct our attention to our common interests and to the means by which these differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can make the world safe for diversity. Think of this joint Russian-Chinese statement about diversity of civilizations and diversity of paths. And then think of our current policy of autocracies versus democracies in a new kind of a Cold War. What are the moral dimensions of all this? What's the right path? Kennedy said, for in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. I mean, having been such staunch defenders of human rights all around the world, would we be willing to live with a world order less concerned with human rights, more focused on a kind of a transactional world order of mutual convenience? Is that something we could morally accept as a nation? I don't know the answer to that. But I think that the question is increasingly posed by the crises we're facing now. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention. I did go on too long, but I look forward to your questions.
What is the role of the United Nations in all of this?
Excellent question. And as I said, Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa was pretty much dismissing it, especially the Security Council. I mean, the UN Security Council is very divided because there are 5 permanent members with vetoes. And so it's a constant source of frustration. Occasionally things get done. When we went into Libya, both Russia and China abstained and allowed that to happen. They since have said that that was a mistake, that this whole idea of sort of humanitarian intervention was misused in that case. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, it's a problem. It was started by Roosevelt. His concept of the UN was that of the 4 policemen. He believed that the UN should be aware of the geopolitical divisions in the world, and that there were 4 basic powers, and they should all have a veto. Then they added France as the 5th. And then the General Assembly was on a democratic basis, 1 country, 1 vote. So it's always been sort of 2 institutions in one, and very unwieldy. The place where the UN does well is peacekeeping occasionally, and actually on sustainability, on what I think are some of the key issues. They do a lot. I mean, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, this organizes a lot of activity among nations trying to get at climate change. Tremendous success against poverty in the developing world. So the UN in certain areas is actually very necessary, but when it comes to the kind of issues I'm talking about here, rather impotent.
So I'm thinking about what Rick Nolan often says. He talks about the number of dollars we spend on the military, on war throughout the world. And I wonder how many ambassadorship positions, how many foreign service positions are open right now that we don't have people there, and how much do we spend on actually looking for peaceful solutions rather than angry solutions?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we have been using sanctions as kind of a first policy in a lot of cases.
That's not really peaceful.
No, and it is. I know it's somewhat coercive. Yes, our diplomacy really is decimated at this point. It's been both administrations really since the end of the Cold War. It seemed as if there was less justification. We had won the Cold War, and I remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the Senate advocated abolishing the CIA. Why would we need that anymore? Anyway, so yes, we have many unfilled positions. Morale is very low at the State Department right now, partly because of the Havana syndrome, this kind of inexplicable disease that is affecting a fair number of diplomats, actually. COVID hasn't helped. China is way outspending us on diplomacy. They are, I think, for every 1 U.S. economic diplomat in Africa, there are like 15 Chinese, for example. And the State Department has been using this China gap, right, the China threat, the China gap, as an excuse to try to get more money for the State Department, right? And some of the biggest advocates for more money for diplomacy are the Pentagon. Robert Gates, Jim Mattis were strong proponents, because the military ends up doing a lot of things that they don't really want to do, like nation building and that sort of thing. But I just think in this current environment, we're heading into a more multipolar situation. There's going to have to be some very nimble and astute diplomacy. We're not going to be able to use just blunt instruments. We could get away with it when we were so clearly dominant, but this is a new situation. So any students here, I mean, we're going to need excellent young diplomats going forward, and a new generation focused on global affairs. So I don't know if I answered you, Beth, but that's, yeah.
Two questions. One, Putin is, I think, 68, which is actually kind of old for a Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a video released of him today with a noticeable limp and a really shaky hand, and people jumped right on it and said, "Oh, it's Parkinson's. That's what
Yeah.
he has."
Yeah.
And so if he goes away, what happens? And the second question is, did Russia really try and relink the ruble to gold in the last month or so? Maybe you don't know that one. But.
Yeah, well, they're talking about relinking to commodities. And it might have been, they're talking about it in conjunction with the new Chinese digital currency. It might have been in that context where they're cooperating on what will be a currency linked to commodities. You know, the dollar was linked to gold always after World War II until 1971, when we were building up a huge deficit because of Vietnam, right? And countries began to doubt that we would ever honor our commitments. So Charles de Gaulle, in a very French fashion, had the French government come to us and demand gold. They took their dollar assets, came to us and said, there they are, okay, please, the gold, please. Whereupon Nixon, the Nixon shock took place, where Nixon took us off the gold standard, right? And so ever since then, it's not been linked to anything. It's the full faith and confidence in the US dollar that is the dollar's grounding. And many historians say that actually at that moment, we're like, what's going to happen here? The fact that the Saudis very quickly agreed to accept dollars that way, you know, at that point, as even now, energy was a huge part of the global economy and trading system. And so that Saudi move is seen as having been instrumental to the acceptance of the dollar. And that's why it's so ironic that right now the Saudis are not returning our phone calls. They are talking about currency swap arrangements with the Russians. They are engaged in all kinds of non-dollar activities. The Saudis are right now. Yeah, you know, the ruble is so weak. It's hard to imagine that it could be linked, but in conjunction with the Chinese, you could have this. Now, Putin, yes, he does look a little bit bloated. I mean, there's one theory that he has syphilis, for goodness sakes. You know, that's another theory, or like Parkinson's. And 68 is old. I mean, in the 90s, I think the life expectancy for men was like 56 because of cardiovascular and cerebral vascular disease from drinking, basically. But you know, as I said earlier, we can't just personalize this. It's not just Putin. Unfortunately, it would be wonderful if it were. But he's part of a group. And there are identifiable members of this group, like this fellow Patrushev that I mentioned, who would be in the wings if Putin failed. There are factions in Russia. So I don't know. I know that in Washington, there's strong desire to be rid of this character. I mean, and to have the Ukraine crisis be part of his downfall. But it's unclear to me what will come next. You could have a more nationalist leader, potentially, even. Someday, these younger generations will hopefully manifest themselves in Russia and in Belarus. But that's not going to get us out of the current crisis.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, you mentioned under USSR that Lenin had the Republic of Ukraine, and Ukraine has, again, this different ethnic groups and whatever.
Yeah.
So what was the rationale, or do you know how did it come about that they put Ukraine together as it is today?
Yeah. You know, for the Soviets, theoretically, the Soviets were communists. They were not nationalist, right? They were not, I mean, they were trying to set up a union. In fact, that was one of the reasons the Soviet Union fell apart, was because Yeltsin and Russia had a very negative view of the Soviet Union. They felt that the Russians had been exploited in this 15 republic structure, that it's almost like the North giving more money to the South kind of a dynamic. There was a lot of Russian resentment about the Soviet structure. And that's why Russia and Ukraine worked together to force the breaking up of the Soviet Union. It's so ironic now, looking back. They both wanted the same result. But I think for a Russian nationalist, old Russian nationalist like Putin, the idea of not just having this be a socialist Russia, right, in which, as the Tsarist Empire had been, with all these different ethnic groups, like the Ottomans. I mean, the Ottomans didn't subdivide I mean, they had little districts and things, but they didn't structure it in like, a Syrian republic or a Jewish republic or whatever. And so I guess that's the gripe that Putin has against the old Soviet system. And that's why, the famous quote about Putin is that, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest disaster of the 20th century. The quote that you hear in Russia more is when he said, "No one with a heart can help but lament the demise of the Soviet Union. Nobody with a head would seek to restore it." Which one is right? I don't know.
Another quick question.
Yes.
You mentioned the neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, the original Nazis would believe in the superiority of the Aryan nation.
Yes.
And so the neo-Nazis in Ukraine now, are they against the Russians, or what minority? Who are they? Who are they opposed to?
They're white supremacists. They're white supremacists, but they're also Ukrainian nationalists. They look to a fellow named Stepan Bandera from World War II. He's the big hero. You'll see large demonstrations in Kiev with Bandera. They call them banderistas. And what happened was, as the Nazis approached Ukraine, this juggernaut heading east, they came into Western Ukraine, and they promised the Western Ukrainians that if they would fight alongside the Nazis, they would get a state. The Nazis knew that the Eastern Ukrainians would probably not, because they were so close to the Russians. So for a number of years, you had the Nazis and the Western Ukrainians fighting against the Russians and the Eastern Ukrainians, which is a deep scar, obviously, in this whole business. And Bandera, for a time, the Nazis put him in prison because he became too nationalistic. He came out again, and he lived after the war. He was assassinated, probably by the Russians, in the 50s, I think. But he's gone from being the hero of the Azov group to more broadly a hero of Ukraine. And Zelensky, my understanding of this now, and I mean, nobody knows 100%, but when he came in, when he was elected, he was on a peace ticket. He was going to go and meet with Putin and work this out, find some solution. And he received threats from the Azov group, among others, who do not want any kind of compromise. As the army got stronger, he then reconciled with these groups and brought them into the military command structure. Right? So there was a reconciliation between Zelensky and the Azov group several years ago. So there we are. And now, in the current circumstance, Zelensky has talked about neutrality for Ukraine. Very hard to know what he means by this, but he said, we're going to talk about this. Well, I think he's beginning to get threats again, because these groups want to win this war. Having sacrificed this much blood, they want to go all the way. And I think that he's being told by Washington not to compromise this way, because we don't want to give Putin any semblance of victory at all. So it's a very complicated situation right now on the ground. And I feel sorry for Zelensky being in the middle of all these different forces coming at him. And what neutrality would look like now is so hard to say, because the Russians are not about to give back Crimea or the Donbass. So what kind of state would this be?
How do you see the future of NATO?
Well, it's strengthening right now. I mean, you've got, for the moment, the Germans are doing more. They're going to be spending more on their military. They're agreeing to send weapons for the first time. You've got Finland and Sweden talking about joining NATO. So, and that's right on the border with Russia. So, you could say that Putin is producing the opposite of what he wants. Now, if their idea is to slam the door on the West and become a huge nuclear porcupine, which appears to be their path right now, well, then maybe that's not so important that happen. And also, Sweden all through the Cold War was actually very closely associated with NATO. I served in Stockholm, and even as Olof Palme was talking about neutrality, there were all these secret agreements that pretty much made Sweden a de facto member of NATO. All these documents became public in the late 90s. And the Swedish population was shocked, although it was far enough in the past that it wasn't a big issue. Finland is different. Finland is right on the border, and there's a long history there. I mean, I can see why the Finns are thinking this way, but it's a new generation. The older generation of Finnish leadership would have been very cautious, but we have a new generation now in Europe. I mean, the Prime Minister of Finland is 36 years old. Her name is Jenna, well, anyway, very smart, but very young. And I think the new generation now is less cautious than the old generation would have been. Like I said, there's not much that Russia can do about it. Let's see, who's next here? Yes.
This might be a dumb question, but do you feel that fear could be playing a factor into why so many countries are not necessarily against Russia or allies of Russia right now?
Yeah, I'm sure that, a lot of politics is fear-based. India fears being cut off from Russian weapons. A number of countries are afraid of losing Russian oil and gas. A number of countries who are quite dependent on China now that China has allied with Russia, they maybe fear that there be negative reactions. I don't think that many countries fear an invasion from Russia is punching way above its weight right now. Boy, I'll tell you, as I mentioned, they are decimated by COVID. They already have a very young youth population. Very small, because in the 90s, the birth rate collapsed in Russia in the chaos of the 90s. So these generations are very small in Russia already. So in terms of a military that could go out, and as Blinken said yesterday, our goal now is to prevent Russia from ever doing this kind of thing again anytime soon, right? So we're saying, like, but I don't think they would ever try to go toward a NATO country, for example. That'd just be too big a risk for them. I think the Baltic states are safe because they're in NATO. And so, but there's a fear. Sure, there's always a fear factor in international politics. And I think, but I think the Russians I think the Russians are afraid too. Just given the history of invasions over the years, it's deep in their psyche to fear invasion from the West. And so there's a lot of irrationality, and that's why there's got to be dialogue. There's got to be a return to serious diplomacy. Who's next? Yes.
My question is, or statement is, that George Kennan, back in the 40s, came up with the Russia containment policy.
Yes.
And then later in life, he said NATO is an organization defending against an enemy that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And then how do you look at the Mexico scenario as relating to NATO?
To NATO?
Yeah, do you know what I mean by that?
Can you speak into the mic a little bit?
Well, in other words, what would we do if a foreign alliance was in Mexico?
China had strong alliances with Mexico, Mexico had missiles pointed at the U.S., it wouldn't last for a second.
Well, that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about too, right? That's what the Cuban crisis, the same thing. Both China and Russia have a little bit of this sort of like, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Why can't you understand our concerns in our immediate periphery when you have a Monroe Doctrine? And I think our reason is that we are stronger and we are a more moral power in our own self-conception, right? I think that's why we believe that we should play by different rules. George Kennan, I knew George Kennan, and you're right. He came up with a containment he was a Foreign Service officer, and it started as an embassy cable. I wish the Foreign Service were doing things like that today. But anyway, and he was just a kid from Wisconsin, George Kennan, who came in through the Foreign Service exam. Later in life, yes, he began to think that the nuclear confrontation was suicidal for the species, and he was a strong opponent of NATO expansion. I remember hearing him at the Wilson Center in 1994, and he said, "This is the biggest mistake of U.S. foreign policy since World War II. And mark my words," he said, "we will face a revanchist Russia within 20 years. And of course, this was 1994, and 2014 is when the Ukraine, Crimea crisis. I mean, he was like correct to the year. Yeah, he's an interesting, very interesting character. And, you know, I mean, people forget this, but, you know, at one point, Prince, was it Leopold Habsburg came down to become the King of Mexico in the 19th century. And we were all upset about this. He died fairly soon after that. But for a little while, there was a sense that, oh my God, the Europeans are going to come in here and try to colonize Mexico. And there was a lot of fear that the Germans, you know, the Zimmermann telegram had to do with Mexico. What if the Nazis, or in that case, World War I, what if they start to align? You know, the British were always worried that the Germans would ally with the Irish, right? That they'd face a northern flank if Germany and Ireland united, you know, because that's how bad the relations were between the Brits and the Irish after the 1920s. So, yeah, I mean, we would not allow that. And so the Russians now, last point on this, they're kind of saying, well, we're close to Venezuela, you know, maybe we'll do something threatening with Venezuela. But in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they needed a platform like Cuba. This time they don't need that. They have these stealth submarines that they can bring right off of our coasts. And so they don't really need that kind of an alliance to threaten us.
A question, how much damage do you think the previous administration's apparent cozying up to Russia has led to the unstableness in the world today?
Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, you know, the previous administration weakened NATO, you know, with all the rhetoric, and yet right now we see NATO coming together. But I think the damage was done. I think beneath the surface, this huge unity of NATO is situational and doesn't really tell you necessarily what the future holds. The irony about the Trump administration is that in spite of this bromance with Putin, his administration was far tougher on the Russians than, say, Obama had been, right? It was the Trump team that sent lethal weapons to Ukraine for the first time, that closed our embassies and consulates in Russia. The sanctions were vastly increased. Now you can say, okay, the sanctions was because of Congress, right? So, but I'm not sure that Trump was fully aware of what his team was doing on Ukraine. There was a fellow named Kurt Volker, who was the czar for Ukraine, a really I know Kurt, he's a virulently anti-Russian. And he's the one that got the Javelin missiles and the Stingers into Ukraine and we trained, the reason that they're performing so well right now, the Ukrainian army, is because we've been training them. And that was happening in the 4 or 5 years previous. So the whole Trump phenomenon is a very confusing mixed bag when it comes to Russia. I've had a couple of people ask me, well, what would have happened if Trump had been president in this current crisis? And I mean, you know, you might have had a kind of a wacky Kim Jong-un type of, you know, I'll meet with him and solve this kind of a thing, right? He might have actually established a dialogue with Putin on this, you know, once they laid down the red lines in November. Maybe. He would have faced a lot of opposition from everybody if he tried to do that. I mean, right now, the Republican line going to the elections will be that yes, that they maybe could have prevented the crisis. They won't say how. And then they'll say, and besides, it was our debacle in Afghanistan that made Putin think that we were so weak and disorganized that he could take this risk. In other words, it's because of Afghanistan. That's going to be the line.
With your professional and personal experience, do you think the Russians have something over Trump with the way that he interacted with them?
You know, those rabbit holes go so deep. You know, it's really, it's beyond my pay grade. I mean, you know, the Steele dossier has been pretty roundly discredited now. Even the Democrats, even the New York Times are pretty much going after it. So I think there were excesses in the portrayal of Trump, but that there might be something there, either with his real estate deals over there or God knows what. You can't rule it out. You know, I don't know.
I'm just wondering how green energy might change the world order.
Well, we have to hope that it'll change it fundamentally and make us less dependent on fossil fuels and make fossil fuels less of a casus belli, a cause of war. We have to be hopeful. And, it's going to take some real technological breakthroughs. And, of course, there's a lot of research underway on this sort of thing, on photosynthesis, for example, that we can do what plants do in converting energy. That's Bill Gates' big idea. But those solutions are going to take time. And the problem is that in the short term, we're going massively back to the old fuels. Germany is going to start producing coal now like there's no tomorrow, right, as they try to keep their economy afloat. It's going to be, everybody's going back to coal. I described Biden's about face on energy. So I think that in the medium term, we're going backwards, but that in the longer term, we have to get to green, and we have to, whether it's wind. I mean, it's a lot of our hedge funds and things see the value now that actually they can make money on this. And China is trying to become a dominant figure in the new energy, right? They're investing massively. So we have to hope that these longer trends will play out. But like I say, it's not going to get us out of this current crisis, unfortunately. Yes, Bob.
Tom, it seems to me that one of the things that's going on is that we're having the option of going back to Cold War #2 in a fight for who's going to be the dominant power on the planet. And the other question is, will the United States finally have the humility to say we're going to have to work together with other countries in order to solve these global problems, like global warming, like immigration because of global warming, food supplies, pandemics, all those things that are, it doesn't matter who's the dominant one, we're going to have to work together somehow to get there.
Yes. No, as I said at the end there, we face these really shared global threats now, which are all the more apparent with the pandemic, with the climate change we see happening around us. And these are going to necessitate close cooperation. Obama, in one of his books, The Audacity of Hope, there's a whole section where he talks about the need for cooperation on these issues. And he says straight out, he says, we may not agree with the political systems of Russia and China, but they are willing to cooperate with us on these issues, and we should do so. I mean, he sounds almost like Kennedy a little bit there. Now, he didn't really follow that as much as president. I mean, this was in Audacity of Hope. And as I said at the end, there's a moral issue for a lot of Americans. How could we not stand up for human rights, for instance, in Xinjiang? Should we give the Chinese a break on Xinjiang? I mean, should we say, okay, it's your domestic issue. We want you to do this right. We want you to look at us as this wonderful functioning model that you could be if, I think it would be nice if we could do that. Our early presidents all said, we should not get involved outside of our borders, but we should create a city on a hill, a shining example for the rest of mankind. And that's been, our early presidents were all on that wavelength. We've had a kind of a Wilsonian approach since of trying to promote our version of human rights worldwide, right? And so, and many Americans have known nothing else but that outlook. And maybe it is the right outlook. Maybe if we persevere and persist and are strong enough, we can convert the world that way. But I mean, the track record obviously is a little bit spotty. I must say, I'm just so depressed about Afghanistan, where we spent 20 years. Initially, it was, to get rid of Al-Qaeda and then the Taliban. When Obama came in, for Hillary Clinton, it was all about women's rights in Afghanistan. That really is the one reason we stayed longer and longer and longer on a human rights basis. We've purported always to be trying to help the people of Afghanistan. And then after the debacle now, we're seizing their national assets. We're increasing the starvation and the poverty among the very people we wanted to help. I don't understand it. I really don't. And I think there's okay, Morally, we're against the Taliban because they're not democratic. So we have a moral reason for withholding their national assets. But at whose expense? So many times the sanctions hit the population, they hit the people of the country, and the elites go unscathed. So I don't know, Bob. I mean, it's, I think it's a moral dilemma. And frankly, I think that America will stay on this democracy promotion. It's in everyone's interest that we be the strongest power. I think we're going to be on that wavelength for a good while. And you know, when you really talk to strategists in Washington, what they'll say is, or John Mearsheimer, one of the most famous realist historians, will say, well, if we allow a hegemon to emerge, say in Asia or Europe, then they will have the power to start messing around in our neighborhood. And we might start facing these kind of threats close at hand. So to prevent, it's like Putin saying, let's fight them in Ukraine and not in Russia. Well, let's fight them in Taiwan and in Ukraine and not take any risk that they might start to come close to our shores. I know, it's a huge strategic and moral dilemma. It's up to the new generation to figure all this out. If any of you students are still here. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. We're going to need diplomacy for sure.
Well, we want to thank everybody for coming tonight. Tom is going to stick around to answer some personal or questions if you want to ask some more questions. Next forum, we'll have somebody a little more inspiring, so you're not going home all gloomy. Tom, thank you so much. So you did a great job. It's very
pleasure. Thanks, you guys.
Informative.
Oh, well, I know. It's a confusing time. It is. Hi there.
If I get your email, I'd be interested in asking you some questions about becoming president.